How many miles should you put on an exotic car? Now, as with all of the other advice and information that I've shared on this channel, this is simply what I've done and why I've done it. It's not necessarily the best thing or the right thing to do, depending on what your opinion is. It's just what I've chosen to do, so take the information for what it is. The first thing I'll address is daily driving a supercar. Can you do that? Absolutely. Should you do that? Well, I guess it depends on your situation. I think it goes without saying that something that could be deemed as an exotic car or a supercar or pretty much any kind of high performance car is going to provide a very unique driving experience. But in order to provide that driving experience, it's typically compromised in some way, especially when it comes to comfort. So in the case of daily driving a car, depending on what kind of daily driving you're doing, then it might actually make sense to daily drive a supercar. But if your commute is an hour and a half there and back every single day, being in a supercar doing highway miles, just cruising, it's not the most pleasurable experience. I've always found it funny when people brag about how many miles they put on their car, because not all mileage is equal, especially when you're talking about cars like this, where if you took your car to the track 3 times, that is, in my opinion, much more of a true experience of what that car has to offer versus driving it for 10,000 miles on the highway to work and back every single day. That is just cruising in a really expensive car versus actually using the car partially for what it's designed for. For me, the miles that matter in an exotic or a high performance car are the miles where the car that you're driving is enhancing the experience. If you're just putzing around in the city at stoplights in a Ferrari or a McLaren, who really cares? Everyone else in all of their cars are having the exact same experience as you. Granted, if that's what you enjoy doing, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Like I said in a previous video, you have to do what makes you happy. But just because you have a lot of miles on your high-end expensive car doesn't necessarily mean that you've enjoyed it more as somebody else who has a lot less miles. And that's not to say that there aren't people that buy these cars and hardly ever drive them, but hey, if that's what you enjoy, if that's what makes you happy, you do you and I'll do me. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Just as an example, if I'm gonna take out my Performante, I'm probably not gonna take it to do regular everyday activities. Not to say that I don't take it to the grocery store every once in a while just for fun, but in general, when I take out this car, I find that the most enjoyable experience that I'm gonna get out of that car is when I'm driving it with really nowhere to go. Now let's talk specific mileage. How many miles should you put on your exotic car? Well, scenario number 1, you've bought this car and you plan on keeping it for the rest of your life, at which point the amount of miles you put on the car, quite frankly, doesn't matter all that much. Of course, understand that you're going to incur more costs by driving an exotic car more. Obviously, that's going to use more gas, brakes, tires, servicing, potential repairs. A lot of the parts on these higher end cars do wear out more quickly, especially depending on the type of driving that you're doing. But again, if you're planning on keeping the car forever and the resale value does not matter at any point in time, then drive it as much as you want. Scenario number 2, which I think is a lot more common, and certainly the scenario that I fall under, is that you have this car, you want to keep it in your possession for X amount of time, at which point you're probably going to want to sell it. So how many miles should you put on that car in order to still be able to get maximum value for your car at the end of X amount of time? I think the answer to this equation very much depends on the specific car, it depends on where you live, and it also depends on the market at any given time. You guys might have seen the video where I talked about the true cost of owning a supercar, and it was my 2016 Lamborghini Huracan that I bought brand new, basically right when the car first came out. There were very few available in the country, so it didn't make sense to buy a used one. I bought a new one instead. After 2 years, when I sold that car, it had roughly, and I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but it was about 12,000 kilometers. I'll put the conversion on screen. I'm Canadian, sorry, I'm more familiar with kilometers than I am with miles. But at 12,000 kilometers after 2 years, that might not seem like a lot, but it was right at the very top of the highest mileage Huracans for sale in the entire country. I should also mention that because I live in Canada, specifically a part of Canada where we get a proper winter, for basically 6 out of the 12 months, these cars are pretty well undrivable. Obviously with this AMG GTR, I put some winter tires on it, and honestly, it's the first time I've ever driven a car like this through the winter season, and while it was inconvenient at times, it's something that I really enjoyed. But cars like that and cars like that, they get put away for half the year, which basically means that they're not picking up any mileage whatsoever. All this to basically say that the mileage that you're going to see on cars in this particular country, in this particular area, are going to be a little bit different over the course of 2 or 3 years versus what you'd see in Florida or California, when there really isn't a winter and you can drive these cars pretty much all year round. And that for me has always been the golden rule in regards to how much mileage you should put on your car based on how long you are looking to keep it. You never want to have the highest mileage one on the market. I was in the process of editing this video and I realized that I forgot to address the people that say, if I had a car like that, I drive it every single day. Who cares about the mileage? Well, if you are in a position to own a car like a Lamborghini, or if it's an expensive car in general, then you probably have a job and you probably are quite busy. So the likelihood of you having several hours a day of free time to go out and drive in your Ferrari or Lamborghini is probably very unlikely. These are things that you use for enjoyment when you have free time. So unless your job is legitimately to drive a Ferrari across the country, then it's probably going to have lower miles than a normal car. Now, if you go to almost any exotic car dealership, whether it's a new or used car, if you ask about mileage, the salesperson is likely going to tell you something like this: put as many miles on it as you want. It's not really going to affect the value. And to a certain extent, they are kind of right. But when you do go to resell that car, should you actually have the highest mileage one or one of the highest mileage examples in the country or the region or the market that you're trying to sell that car in, you can't tell me that your car is going to be less desirable and the price is therefore going to be driven down. So let's say, as an example, you have 3 Ferraris. They're all spec'd the exact same way. The only thing that's different about them is after 3 years, they all have different mileage. One has basically delivery miles, let's say 200 miles. The second one has about 3,000 miles. So over the course of 3 years, this guy drove the car, but not very much. It was like a weekend car for the most part. And then the third car has 10,000 miles, way more than the other two. Which one do you think is going to command the least amount of money? I think the answer is pretty obvious, and you can definitely make the counter argument that the amount of extra depreciation that that guy who drove his car 10,000 miles incurred is made up for in the fact that he actually got to experience and enjoy the car significantly more than the other 2 Ferrari owners that are also now looking to sell their car. But again, it just depends on what your objective is for that particular car. I guess my point here is that when you get into that territory where you now have one of the highest mileage examples of whatever car it may be, now you're kind of in unknown territory where you're pretty much at the mercy of a dealer or potentially a private buyer to offer you whatever they're deeming the car is worth, because from the owner's perspective, you don't really have a lot of bargaining power to try and get maximum value for your car, even if it's in pristine condition, because the mileage is pretty much the #1 thing that people look at when buying a used exotic car. Whether it's true or not, people have this assumption or preconceived notion that higher mileage means that more things are likely to break, more things are likely to need to be changed, that it's just a higher risk situation in what is kind of already deemed to be a high risk purchase in the first place. The only time higher mileage isn't going to matter as much is when there's still a lot of demand and hype around a particular car. So in the case of my 2016 Huracan, 2 years after I purchased it, there were still very few of them available in the country and there was still super high demand for the car. So it made sense based on, 1, I felt like I wanted to move on anyways, and 2, I felt like I had put the maximum amount of mileage on that car that made sense based on the market at that time. Had I waited another 6 months and the hype kind of died down on regular Huracan because Performante was unveiled, yeah, I probably would have lost a lot more money, but the timing made sense. And again, you kind of just have to watch the market when it comes to trying not to lose as much money as you could potentially lose on an exotic car. And let me just give you a real life example of the 3 cars that I currently own. My AMG GTR I bought with 2,400 kilometers on it. I just checked, it's now just over 9,000 kilometers. And honestly, I plan on daily driving this car for probably the next 2 years. And I'm anticipating putting 30 to 35,000 kilometers on it. So this is going to be by far my highest mileage car out of these 3. my Lamborghini Huracan Performante, more than likely I would look to move it probably at the end of the season. So in the fall of 2020 is probably when I would want to move it. Maybe in the spring of 2021, we'll see what happens there. This car currently has just over 7,000 kilometers. And I think what my objective mileage for this car is probably going to be between 12 and 15,000 kilometers based on what's out there. Luckily, there are some higher mileage Performantes for sale right now, so it doesn't really make me feel too bad about putting higher mileage on this car, but we'll see what happens with that. And then as for my Alpha 4C, quite honestly, I don't even know what kind of mileage it has right now. I only drove it like 3 months last fall, but I want to say it has like 6,000 or 7,000 kilometers on it right now, but I don't plan on selling that car anytime soon, and I'm not really concerned about how many miles I put on it. I think where things can get a little bit more tricky when it comes to mileage is when you're talking about limited edition vehicles. So for example, if you have a special edition Ferrari, let's say a 488 Pista, the value is definitely going to be attached to the mileage of the car. If you have a delivery miles Pista, 5 years down the line, it's probably going to be worth more than a Pista that's done 5 or 10,000 miles. So something to keep in mind. But at the same time, that 10,000 mile Pista is still probably going to be worth more than what you paid for it based on the fact that the car is still super rare. So yes, it's done some depreciation in the time that you've driven it and you've enjoyed the car and you've experienced it, but because there's still such high demand on that particular vehicle, it can still command a price over list depending on the market. And for me personally, while I've never purchased one of these cars, I do aspire to own something like that one day. So for me, what I would personally look for as a buyer in that special edition kind of super limited car market is I would personally go after a car that actually does have a higher mileage on it based on the fact that I don't have to feel bad about driving it and depreciating it more than it's already depreciated. When you're at 10,000 miles, what's 20,000 miles if the car is still in such high demand? Whereas if you pay that premium for a delivery miles car, yeah, I guess you're getting something brand new, but you definitely know where the price is going to go once you start putting some miles on it. So for me, you buy a limited edition car with no miles, you almost can't drive it if you want to maintain what I guess some people view as an investment, because as soon as you start to drive it, that investment is definitely going to lose value. Something else I'll bring up from the buyer's perspective is that just because you see a car with low mileage doesn't necessarily mean that it's like new. And I'll use the Aventador SV as an example because I feel like there are tons of them for sale with next to no mileage, which seems like, hey, nobody really drove it. What's the concern here? But I've seen firsthand, and I'm not going to name any names. Quite frankly, I don't even know who the guy was, but I was at this car meet. Cars were sitting there for hours already. Somebody asks this guy if he can rev his Aventador SV. He does not hesitate. He jumps in the car, cold start, and literally pins the throttle down, revving this car for a solid 2 minutes. I couldn't believe it, and it scared the crap out of me because an Aventador SV, it's one of those dream cars for me, and I see so many of them available with like 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers. Basically, nobody even touched them. But just because a car has low mileage doesn't mean that it hasn't spent tens, if not hundreds of hours being revved in a parking lot. That's not something that shows up in the mileage on the car. So I don't want to scare people away from used exotic cars with low mileage, but it's definitely something to consider, and it's part of the reason why I've always trended towards buying a used exotic car from a dealer, mainly based on the fact that often when you buy a used exotic car from a dealer, it's also going to come with a warranty. So should something go wrong because of these things that the previous owner did, there's a lot less to worry about. At the end of the day, high dollar cars are pretty much a pay to play game. If you buy the right ones, they're not going to be as expensive as some other choices that you could potentially make. But when it comes to mileage, this is some of the logic that I've used that I feel for the most part has allowed me to enjoy the cars. I really feel like every time I get in any of these cars, I'm using them in such a way where I'm having a positive experience every time. Like I said, daily driving a supercar isn't necessarily always a positive experience. So in terms of like smiles per mile, if you want to say that, I think that I've definitely got my money's worth out of them. And again, I'm somebody that kind of likes to experience a car and then try something new. If that's your ultimate goal, I really feel like the advice that I shared in this video can at the very least be helpful. Anyways, guys, that's it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to support it with a like. If you have any questions regarding what I discussed in this video, please leave it down below and I'll try to get an answer out to you. And if you have any suggestions for other kind of topics around cars that you'd like to hear me discuss based on personal experience, leave those suggestions down below in the comments as well. If you're not subscribed to the channel already, make sure you subscribe for more weekly car videos. And other than that, guys, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.